one thing that we would even do a lot of the time that was honestly just driven by laziness more than like anything else, and that I think the vast majority of PFers that I know also do, they'll have one contention and they'll go for it 80% of the time on the F, and then they'll have a contention on the neg that they go for 80% of the time, and then they'll have like two other links and impact that they just rarely go for. And that's not the way to do it at all.
Hello! We are Proteus Debate Academy, and as you can see, once again with us, we have Mr. Jack Johnson. Jack, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it, guys. Good to be back.
The fan service episode. You know, you got to get one in kind of every year, every season. I don't know if you've seen this, Jack, but like if you go to Proteus Debate and you like search by view count or whatever, it's just not even close, dude. Like it might be, I don't want to say it's triple, but I'm almost positive it's double like the next highest video by like a fairly significant margin. So yeah, dude, awesome. That's some name appeal, bro, for sure.
I am glad people liked it.
Yeah, this video is just going to be called Jack Johnson.
Yeah. It's just again.
No, so we had been in contact a little bit. We wanted to do another sort of video, and one of the ideas that came up was that I had just written a case for some debaters. It was going to be their first elementary school public forum debate, and so I was like, sure, I'll write a case for you. And though they were in elementary school, is pretty much the case that I would read if I was competing in public forum. And these kids were like, we wrote our own case. We don't want your help. And I was like, great, that's fine. So the case hasn't been used, but it's on the NSDA topic, and we thought it'd be cool if we went over that case with Jack and you did some coaching for us, basically, because we have debate experience, obviously, but there's a lot of subtext and nuance that is like specific to each debate event that we wouldn't really know without having competed in public forum at a high level. And it's also a chance to get a, look at how you approach coaching and stuff like that, or at least looking at a case. And so if we're all good, I can pull up the case and start kind of talking about what it is.
I would just say before that, just to clarify with Jack, obviously you do coaching. You've got some coaching right after this, so we appreciate you fitting us in. But is this a fairly common thing that when you hear people requesting you coach them, is it case analysis, or is it more working on their skill sets, or where does that kind of land in the work you typically do, just to give people a reference before we move into actually doing it, I suppose?
Yeah. So obviously we're in the summer right now, so it's vast majority just skills development stuff. Totally. But during the actual season, it's a pretty close to 50-50 split between like topic prep and skill development. And of topic prep, casing is certainly one of the more important things that you do. So casing is a pretty big one.
And if I'm not mistaken, the last time we talked, because I've seen the interview like 6 times, you had mentioned that sort of your senior year, based on you having been so busy with Team USA or whatever, you went to like, I think it was Glenbrooks or something to that effect, and you had decided to not just like go all in on really prepping giga case and second lines and blocks and kind of prepping everything out and kind of just rely on your skill set. And so is that still kind of the opinion you're at, where you're like, you need a good enough case, you don't necessarily need to, because obviously with this case, there's not a ton of blocks, just kind of as a preamble here. And so I guess what I'm really asking is, do you think just having a strong case, like in and of itself, independent of the second lines you have, is a serious priority, or do you think the second lines kind of define how good the case is, or is any of that going to kind of inform what we're going to see from you?
I think it all just comes down to how you use it. I think that the vast majority of debaters massively benefit by having that like second line stuff, front lines all written up, weighing written up. All of that stuff is super beneficial. And I think it's great for everybody, even the most skilled debaters, because you might be making those analytics, but if you can make all that stuff with evidence, then you're in that much better of a position. At the same time, though, it's 100% how you make use of it in the round. So you can have the best prep in addition to the case ever, but if you're not delivering it in a simple and concise way, it's not going to matter. And similarly, like we kind of did at Glenbrooks, you can have like not much at all besides the case, but as long as you're able to make, really solid logical arguments and kind of fall back on the strengths of the case itself, then you can get away with a lot as well. So, I think it is really kind of person to person, case by case.
And I would definitely say, and you could pull it up now, Sasan, but I definitely think that is exactly Sasan's approach to cases. Sasan is very big on like, I just want to have true, correct, as subjectively, however you want to put it, right, arguments, so that the defense of them is kind of intuitive to the argument itself rather than relying on, the seventh card down the line.
This is the case. I'll make it a little bit bigger for the audience at home. I like to, honestly, about half of the work I do on a case is formatting. I think this looks nice. You'll notice that everything's like bookmarked. And so this is what it would look like if I was writing it for a student. I don't normally like write their cases, but this is like, okay, here's how to use this document. And here's why just having a case is not everything. Like, you should work hard and do other things and get good at debate. But it's also, if it's your first time, like, you read the parts that are highlighted or underlined. Whatever, this stuff. The case itself is paraphrased, but there's cut card versions below. And I also decided to include, like, okay, what is the strategy behind this case? Like, here's the arguments, but I feel like with just having a case, people don't necessarily know, like, which parts are the important parts, what they're trying to do. I won't really go into this right now. Let's just kind of talk about the case and what it entails. So this is the NSDA NATS topic. Resolved in the United States, social media is beneficial for democratic values. And this is a negative case. Paul, I don't think I've showed this to you, have I?
I've had it. I just have now been cursory glancing through it.
Okay, so you don't know the case, so so I'll kind of explain it a little bit, right? So the way I kind of saw the topic, social media is beneficial for democratic values, is it obviously comes down to what democratic values were. And as I was starting to try to teach kids this topic, I found some topic lecture somewhere, and it was like giving a definition of democratic values that I was really unsatisfied by, because it just wasn't all that, not that there's like an official definition, but it just was kind of like some book somewhere saying democracy is whatever. So what I did is I tried to do some research that is like, okay, what do legal scholars, like, what is the most like legally solid, as close as you can get to a definition of a democratic value. And in doing some research, I found basically a textbook that says democracy is best defined in this 2009 United Nations essay. And in that essay, they say, like, the inherent, like, purpose of democracy is to uphold human rights. And it was like, as seen in the United Nations list of human rights. So that was basically my in. Once I had that, I was like, that feels like a solid enough excuse to be able to use any human right as a democratic value. And so I just went to the right to life and security. I feel like that's something that would get debated a lot. Like, is the right to life a democratic value? I feel confident in my ability, at least, maybe naively so, but to be able to go in there and be like, yeah, well, this thing is pretty much the most authoritative source we have on, what a democratic value means, and they say having a right to life and security is a democratic value. And over here I talk about why the Congressional Research Service is dope, and I forgot to... There you go, that's going to bother me. And the reason I did that is because almost all of this case is taken from a 35-page page Congressional Research Service like paper that's all about like social media and misinformation. And basically I'm using misinformation as a link into the impact of, you know, right to life and security and stuff like that. So my strategy here is I'm going to show with the best evidence I can find that social media leads to misinformation, that misinformation compromises people's lives and safety and things like that. So the first section, I kind of split it into sections rather than contentions. You could look at it as like a one contention case, but rather than it having an A point and a B point that are talking about like different types of links or different types of impacts, it's kind of just establishing the major premises, right? So I have here like, let's figure out what this misinformation looks like. Here's where I'm just trying to prove misinformation happens. And here I'm talking about the majority of adults use Facebook. Everyone on social media is exposed to misinformation, whether they seek it out or not. That the moderation on Facebook and other social media information is completely ineffective. That even when there is accurate information, because, you know, you expect the other side to be like, well, but it also gives you accurate information better than not having social media. It says here in the report, and I'm paraphrasing it pretty closely here, that even when there is accurate information on the same platform, the inaccurate information always spreads more and always like reaches more people, and it's because of the way the algorithms work. And here it's like, okay, well, misinformation is non-unique is going to be an answer I'm looking to be able to avoid. And so I'm just looking for stuff in the paper that's like, why is it unique to social media? And this is where it talks about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was the other potential topic for this, if I recall correctly. And it basically says that no, like other platforms are, like, for example, a news organization can't spread misinformation knowingly that is harmful, but Facebook can, as long as they themselves didn't post that content. They're allowed to promote content other people posted without being held accountable for what's in that content. At least under the current understanding of Section 230. So now here's where it like gains an impact, right? So I am still basically just using the same source for the whole thing and putting a lot of confidence that you're not going to be able to refute or post-date that source. And it says that misinformation complicated the public health response because it made accurate information more difficult to go out, and that's a really important part. And I think the right to like effective healthcare and stuff is in the Human Rights Charter. And it also, it says it more here, like communicating stuff on a timely manner is really important, and the incomplete, inaccurate, misleading COVID-19 information on social media harmed or mitigated the ability to mitigate the negative effects of COVID, and that social media exposure is associated with misperceptions regarding basic facts about COVID-19. And the last thing I kind of just needed was like some sort of impact about COVID-19 itself being significant. So I just cut the only card in here that isn't a CRS card, that isn't establishing the credibility of the CRS, is the World Health Organization says lots and lots and lots of people have been affected by COVID. So I guess like all I'm trying to establish with this case is that the like life and death health impacts should count as a democratic value or something under a democratic value, that misinformation happens, and that misinformation causes a lot of that stuff. I guess kind of just approaching just at that level, what are your thoughts as to, I guess, the case and what the strategy behind it is, or maybe whether that strategy is pulled off well.
Yeah, so definitely a really interesting case. I would say a few things jump out to me immediately. The first thing is that I like how it's centered around one narrative about one really big, clear, present danger that everyone can relate to. I know that COVID-related arguments were traditionally among the most successful arguments among more traditional judges because it's a problem that we have all been affected by in some way, shape, or form. So I think that strategy is immediately a very intelligent and potentially successful strategy. So that is something I think worth emulating. Some more things that I think could improve. One thing I think could have been improved is the warranting in some of the sections. So particularly, I think that there could have been more of an explanation of why algorithms always promote misinformation more
Mm-hmm.
than good information. It's sort of like you come down to relying on the authority, where I feel like there is a more nuanced argument that can be made that justifies why. Sasan, if you want to say something about that, I noticed
No,
you
I
pulled
think
up.
you're absolutely right, and this is something that I've kind of never really like found the sweet spot with in terms of paraphrasing, right? Because in my mind, I'm writing an LD case where the tag says, "Yo, this thing is because of the algorithm," and then in LD you go and read the evidence, right? So if we look here and look at this nifty bookmark, it'll take us straight to the card. The card itself goes into more detail about, like, there's actually two different parts. I have a 7A and a 7B that explains like how the algorithm specifically causes misinformation. But I think you're absolutely right that when we did like the little public forum tournament that we did, it wasn't little, it was very large in my heart, but it wasn't like a real tournament at like a with schools and whatever. And when we did that, one of the things that was happening was I would read evidence where I would be like, this source says that the algorithm is to blame, and I don't really warrant out, or I guess explain why that is. And I guess you can maybe speak to that a little bit. So what is your approach to that? Like, how much of
Yeah.
the internal reasoning do you include in your paraphrasing of the evidence, and how?
So one of the biggest things that we would do in case and also in rebuttal is we wouldn't paraphrase. And I actually think that not paraphrasing, as long as you know how to do it, of course it's difficult in a format where the speech times are half as long as LD, but if you understand how to like cut down a card as efficiently as you can and like only include what of the warrant you really need to include, that's a great way to make sure that you have that really good in-depth internal warranting that you might miss otherwise. So as I look at this card, for example, I see a really good warrant, which is that the algorithm may prioritize content that is likely to sustain user engagement, such as sharing, commenting, or reacting, rather than the content's veracity. So in other words, if you see something that's like, the vaccine has 6 microchips in it and like Bill Gates is outside your window, people are a lot more likely to freak out and respond to it. But if it's just, some boring some just like fact sheet the CDC put out, no one cares. I think that if you use text of cards, those warrants can come out better in case. So yeah, that's one thing I tell my kids to do: read cards in case. That'd be my biggest
Well, and
recommendation.
that's a really interesting point, because I would have thought, because we come from more experience in a carded format, I would have thought that, like, okay, the paraphrasing lets you kind of take advantage of the fact that you can stuff in a lot more cards and a lot more evidence. But it sounds like there's a real trade-off, because if you're not explaining the warrant in that card, it's hard for you later to be like, no, trust me, that card is correct. I guess because unless the card is getting called, people don't actually ever see the logic. I guess maybe it's also easier to dismiss paraphrased cards.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. There is a major trade-off. I also think that among students, I mean, honestly, I think among all students, the majority of the time when you're citing a study or a congressional research report, those authors' words are going to be more compelling than your own words because this is an expert. This is someone that really knows their stuff. So particularly when we're talking about like 14 through 18-year-olds trying to write something just for persuasiveness sake, it can be really helpful to have the original author's words in there. One thing that you can also do to kind of get around the issue of sort of like malleability and flexibility in the presentation of the argument, which everybody wants, but the paraphrasing optimizes, is you can have a card and you can, highlight only the relevant bits. And then you could have just like an analytic right after you read the card that expands upon something that the card didn't really fully flesh out. And then you can just move on to the next card and whatnot. So yeah, those are great ways to improve the communication of your evidence and casing.
And I guess another question I have is that this case was ostensibly written for like a very beginner kind of lay judge approach, because I have to assume that, they're going to their first tournament in elementary school. They're not going to, be getting opponents that are reading cards or judges that are familiar with that. But I guess that calls into question, like, how do you approach your ideal strategy of reading carded evidence? Do you find that it's somewhat less accessible, or do you phrase it in a way where you're like, this is what that author says? Like, how do you approach making that digestible to less experienced judges, or do you have separate cases for separate occasions? What's your philosophy around that?
That's a really good point. I mean, especially if these are, like elementary cases, then, maybe it does make sense to paraphrase and really make things super digestible. But generally speaking, I would do two things. First, you can have, again, to the analytic after the card, you can always have something that's like, in other words, brief summary of the thesis of the evidence. And that accomplishes a lot of what paraphrasing accomplishes, while also giving you the benefit of repetition, which like will really kind of drive a message home in the judge's head a lot of the time. It's not as efficient necessarily, but it can still be very useful. And then the second thing is that I've had to, like recut stuff frequently just because the evidence is so confusing and so difficult to discern. So, that's just one inconvenience of reading cards, but it has other benefits as well, and that's just one element of the trade-off, I think.
I think
go ahead, Paul.
Sort of like, I guess a question I have based on doing some cursory research and looking at it and trying to think about it, and especially trying to think about the wording of the resolution, is from my reading of this resolution, and obviously it's PF, and some of the distinctions between round types are a little bit different because there's not explicit plan text and things, but clearly this is not a policy-based resolution, right? This is like a fact resolution, right? And so I think that fact resolutions to a certain degree change the evaluation of the round, right? Because instead of talking about like impact, so to speak, like it kind of is like, how does this support like the, for lack of a better word, truthiness of the position being taken in the debate? And I think that this case in particular relies fairly significantly upon this definition of like democratic values. And I think that some of the wording in the resolution is really important, right? Because it says like social media is beneficial to democratic values. And I think a debate in my head as Parley Guy, as a format where topicality and arguments like that are fairly common, a lot of questions start raising up, because it certainly does not say is more beneficial than detrimental. Like, it just says is beneficial. It says to democratic values. Is that to all democratic values or only some of them? And how would you measure which democratic values are more important than the other, right? When like, is that a question of impact calculus, or is that a question of topicality in a world where it says like democratic values, right? And I think the reason that matters to me is because when I start doing a glance of like, okay, in a world where I assume that CRS and the UN and the UN's charter and all that stuff is the definitive voice on this, and that democratic values are defined by things that are in the Human Rights Charter, I get to Article 19. And Article 19 of the Human Rights Charter says everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And that seems like it has a significant conflict with the other values you're talking about of like life and security, right? Because it very clearly says on through any media, regardless of the frontiers and things of that nature. And in that sense, all of your arguments that say that like social media is really good at spreading even bad opinions. In fact, it's better at spreading bad opinions and allowing people to have those opinions seems to now get to the question of, well, clearly it is beneficial for that democratic value. And so at that point, is it like, okay, if there are, and this is the whole weird thing with fact rounds and why they're problematic. It's like, okay, if I can find 6 democratic values that social media is good for, and you have 2 that it's bad for, do we evaluate it on like number of values? Because values is certainly plural in the resolution. Or do we evaluate it on any individual value being more important than all of the other ones? And the problem I have is that your framing of the impact is COVID-19 is the most important impact. But the debate seems like it has to ultimately revolve around what is the most important value. Because obviously COVID-19 is a very small subset of the values. And if we were, someone in a kind of jokingly or whatever way in cross-sex was like, yeah, where does the UN, human rights thing mention COVID-19 specifically as something that is whatever, right? Like, I think there's kind of a distinction there. And I think anytime your case is basically predicated on like effectively winning a T debate, you've set yourself up fairly well because you do have, solid sourcing and like, look, I even have sources that say that my first source is the best source and so in those words and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's ever where you necessarily want to be in the debate, right? It sounds like even from your own admission, your plan was like, I can make this thing what the debate is about. And because people won't be ready for that thing, I'll be sort of ahead of the game. And I think the problem with that is, obviously, this is a negative case. You know what I mean? And so you don't know what the app's case is and what their framing is going to be and how they contextualize all those values and things. And so you're really just going for COVID-19's a big deal. Misinformation about COVID-19 has caused issues to some degree, and there's really not great warrants as to like to what degree that is. It just says it has conflated. I looked at the CRS report and whatnot. And they're, in theory, going to have incredibly topic-specific and well-defined, explained stuff that runs counter to that. And obviously that's kind of always going to be the case, but I think it's especially a problem with, as you kind of admit in some of the preamble for the case, such a narrowly tailored case that is very reliant on this. Basically, your case is, I have the 2 best sources. And I think that's never a place you want to be in a debate. I find very rarely, in my experience in evidentiary debate in particular, that people win because someone's like, I had the best source. And I certainly think, based on knowing you in this case and all that stuff, that you have a huge bias for the Congressional Research Service. But I know for a fact that in policy debate, they make fun of that shit all the time, because the Congressional Research Service is basically interns writing white papers that have no actual credentials whatsoever, other than the fact they are researchers for Congress. And you're like, well, if it's good enough for Congress, it's good enough for us. But most people make fun of Congress. Than that?
I have a card. The only part of this case that I was like, okay, this part is bullshit. I realized that my card that is talking about how good a source the CRS isn't saying that the information on every CRS report is highly accurate. It's saying every CRSreport.com accurately represents what the CRS says. Because they're like, yeah, they just published their report. But it's not saying those reports themselves. But I have a couple questions I can synthesize out of what out of what Paul said.
Sorry for being quiet for so long. I was just reading. I'm like, man, this is pretty good. Then I'm like, oh, there's got to be a hole somewhere. You're like, what's going on?
Well, so I have a couple questions based on what Paul just talked about. And the first question is around... So Paul kind of mentioned like fact framing. And I guess in my mind, a fact framing is any time the resolution is asking you to evaluate something, but it's also telling you what you're what you're looking for, right? So it's not just like social media is good. It's like, can you tell me how it's good for democratic values and stuff like that, right? So when that's the case and you kind of know what the resolutions asking us to talk about, how do you approach impacts in that context?
Yeah, so I think there's two things to consider there. So following up on what Paul said about how, there's obviously a lot of different democratic values. The bias in PF is to certainly take one thing and then justify why it's the most important. PF is like massively weighing heavy, especially as you get to the higher levels of the activity. So that would be how I imagine the debate evolving. There would probably be one conception of democratic values that each team would push. And a lot of debates, my guess, would just sort of default to this sort of like util calculation. Because to be honest, a framing for democratic values that's just like protect life becomes pretty darn utilitarian and kind of like skirts out of the values specific debate in a way.
So someone just made a video on that, by the way. Just made a video that's on that exact subject.
So I was judging an LD tournament, and everyone was spending half the round arguing about what the framework and the value criterion should be, but then all of their impacts were like death. And it's like, but you agree, both of your values relate to death, right? So like, why does it matter when you're talking about util, that sounds like kind of the way you're going. But that's an interesting point though. If so much of the meta is around weighing, but ultimately it all ends up around one sort of more util framework, how do you approach that? Do you basically just assume you're going under utilitarianism and talk about lives and just get ready for that to happen?
That's certainly one route you can take, and then just have a more, like traditional PF debate from there, where you just dive into all your classic weighing mechanisms and whatnot and just try to win the round. One thing I would have probably done on this topic, I don't think I would have taken that route, to be honest. So what I probably would have done is, let's say that my big impact is COVID-19. I would have had a couple of cards for why COVID-19 is a unique fundamental threat to democracy. So another democratic principle is equality. COVID, by making everything online, shutting people in their homes, caused a huge upward redistribution of wealth. And that is certainly the opposite of that value. The second thing is that democracies frequently fall as a result of big, prolonged crises. And there's a whole bunch of like anti-establishment sentiment that proliferated throughout COVID, a lot of resentment, a lot of instability in a lot of other areas of the economy. You saw the whole like insurrection happened, like a whole bunch of craziness went on. And I think that the best thing you can do is to have some impact where you can establish a direct link to the resolution, where it's like, no, this is the number one threat to democracy, period, for X, Y, and Z reason. And then you use those reasons as their own pieces of weighing to subsume some of the other impacts that the rest of the other team is going to talk about. Because that also, when you're doing something like COVID, lets you win the util debate, because you still have like all of those like deaths you can fall back on. So you can also win the debate there. But having another path that's sort of like direct to the resolution about the democratic values would be super helpful. So I think I would have included like a card or two about that at some point in the case.
So let me ask real quick, just because from what you're describing there, in your mind, and obviously I don't know how much you've spent looking up the definitions of democratic values, whatever, but in your mind, do you think in this debate you can effectively substitute the words democratic values with the word democracy? Do you think democratic values and democracy function the same in this resolution? And the only reason I'm asking that is because, and I don't necessarily have an opinion, but in the thing you were just saying, you were saying like, if you can show that COVID is a threat to democracy, and I'm wondering if for all intents and purposes, because that's kind of where my mind is at too, where it's like things that are a threat to democracy in some sense seem distinct from things that are a threat to democratic values, right? Because if we look at all these articles in the charter or whatever, like individually, a ton of those things wouldn't actually in any way undermine or threaten the state of democracy. And so I'm just wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, the reason I like democracy, there obviously is a technical difference between the two terms, but the reason why I like going straight to democracy is that what it lets you say is this subsumes all of the democratic values if we don't even have a functioning democracy in the first place. So we can't have any of these values if we're dealing with all of these crises, and we can't even have these discussions and go about our normal democratic business. So definitely there is a difference, but I think it's a difference that actually helps you as the round goes on.
I think there's just so many problems with this resolution. That's really what my thought process is.
About to go.
Coming from, obviously, again, I was part of the debater, and I was certainly a debater who was all about tea, loved telling people they were cheating or whatever. But when I hear this resolution, I'm like, there's just so many problems. Like, I can't. And this is what really confused me, because now that I've learned a bit more on this actually as of late, Sasan, and because me and Sasan have spent an exhaustive amount of time kind of shitting on topic writing at all levels, but Sasan especially has shit on PF topics, right? And some of those things,
understand them. There's enough there for me to question that maybe there's just something I'm missing. I would love to do an interview with the people who do the PF topics and be like, help me understand how we land on this topic.
So on that subject, on that exact subject, I know someone who's on the PF topic writing committee, right?
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, they're definitely on a topic writing committee for the NSDA, right? And it's Chad Meadows. And Chad Meadows is way smarter about debate than either of us. And this is the dude who is on the topic writing committee for college for LD, right? Which also people will inevitably complain about stuff. And I've seen Chad in those college groups, not in the high school ones, obviously, but in the college groups, explain, like, and kind of argue with people about the topic, not like in a defensive manner, but in more of a like, hey, this is just how the process works and whatnot. And like the wording of these resolutions really are thought to death, at least in that context. And maybe again, it's a little different in PF because there's not this expectation of, obviously in LD, the thing that since the rules at the college level say topicality is a rule and counterplans are a thing, like that changes how you have to write the topic. But I am now convinced that there are a bunch of Chad Meadows writing these topics, and they still end up like this. And so, like, I'm just not convinced it's possible to write a topic that, from the perspective of debate events potentially just outside of yours, makes sense. Because to Jack, someone who, in theory, hasn't read a lot of tea in his life, he might see a topic and be like, well, that makes sense because no one's going to read tea. And so the debate will actually be about the substantive implication of it. Whereas if that was a parley topic, the whole fucking debate would be about, like, is beneficial democratic values as like a phrase and stuff. And then there's a whole phrasing of like, obviously it's not a policy round, but like a counterplan debate, K debate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, dude, like when I hear this topic, I'm like, it just sounds like it's begging for a tea debate, but at NSDA and realistically most tournaments, that shit ain't happening.
Yeah.
Like, and so what do you do when you, I guess, long story short, Jack, what do you do when you're given a resolution like this and you know that the affirmative might do something squirrely, wonky, abusive, for lack of a better word, because you don't have a way of checking back for that?
I mean, so to your original point about how these topics get written, I know like a good amount of people on the topic committee. I have no idea how this one was produced by the people that I know.
Okay.
On the committee. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me because they're all like brilliant debaters, technical debaters, a lot of them, and then this comes out of it. So my guess, and what I've seen in years past, is that there is some sort of understanding that, okay, we're going to be more like traditional friendly for the Nats topic because like Nats is a traditional tournament across essentially all formats relative to things like the DOC, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that this was that essentially. This was meant to be, because it gets LD, it seems like a LD resolution. Like
totally.
I've never in my entire career in PF ever had to debate a values resolution. I mean, as far as I can remember. So in terms of what you do, I think the best thing you can do is to have a position that you can defensively link directly back to the resolution in as LD-ish, framing-ish of a way as necessary. And then defend super hard, because the bottom line is whatever the resolution is, you just have to debate it. So coming up with a case that answers it in all its absurdity in the best way possible, I think that's the ideal thing to do.
I have a question that kind of branches off of that, but I feel also speaks to something we spoke about earlier, which was that your case that you kind of talked about how you would approach the topic also was centered around COVID. And you're like, COVID is, people have been doing it, people have been successful with it. I have a coworker, and again, like, we're talking about elementary schoolers and middle schoolers, and this is certainly not a criticism of that coach. But he wanted to do misinformation, but didn't want to use COVID as the example. And I think his logic was that he wasn't sure how certain judges would. He thought it was like a political hot topic, and like, who knows what some judge from some, like, I don't know,
Florida,
right, from one of the Floridas of the world, how they would feel about, like, whether COVID is real or something, right? And so I guess I'll ask it in two separate questions. To what is there a degree to which you try to avoid politically divisive things out of fear that you're going to get a judge that doesn't just doesn't hear it out, or do you kind of just trust your evidence, or trust that the community's pretty progressive? What's your take on that? What's your approach?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Especially at a tournament where I know there's more traditional judges, I will definitely have the political element of it in my mind when I'm deciding what to come up with. One thing that you can do if you have a topic that you want to explore, whether it's something to do with race or inequality or COVID or whatever issues that tend to lean left in terms of who cares about them, you can include in that argument something that would be appreciated by that set of judges. So one great thing you could include in the COVID case is something about how horrible lockdowns are and how they had all these terrible effects. And you can make that argument totally honestly and successfully, and that will totally resonate with one of those judges. So finding positions within positions that are agreeable regardless of your political persuasion is a great way to get around whatever biases may be at play for your judges.
The other question I had based on that is the question of, like, novelty, where it seems like there's benefits to talking about the topics that people are, like, let's say COVID. The most successful people are, I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because I didn't keep up with who won and who was reading what at Nats. But let's imagine that, generally speaking, the most successful negative teams were talking about COVID. So that in some ways signals to you that you should consider talking about COVID in your case. But at the same time, it kind of raises the bar, because now the affirmative teams are getting more and more ready to answer COVID, and maybe some other argument that they're not ready for will be able to slip by. How do you navigate that, either in general, if you can speak to that, or if it would help you to be more specifically imagining this topic? Like, how do you navigate the sort of, like, well-tread path of, I guess this is where a lot of the evidence and a lot of the sort of, like, meta is pointing, versus this is what people are going to be least able to respond to?
I think it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, Nats is a tournament where having a really solid, unique argument can be super beneficial to you, because intel collection is so limited. Nobody knows who is who on the tab room page. Information about who is running what tends to disseminate very slowly. There's limited opportunities to spectate, especially in an online version of the tournament. So running a unique argument can be super helpful at this tournament. The flip side of that is when you're having traditional judges who are infamous for getting confused, for not being able to follow these sorts of arguments, for gut checking things that they think are ridiculous. It's great to have an argument that they've heard before and just run it better and defend it super well. So again, there's not one answer that works in every case.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you always want to do is pick the argument that you that you can explain the best in the most simple way and that you can defend the most. So like you said earlier, you want to pick as true of a position as possible where you're answering the questions and the objections to the case and it just feels and sounds intuitive. So that would be my answer for how to get around that concern, because that's certainly something that I've had to think about a lot and deal with when going to traditional tournaments. So at like Nat Quals and states and Nats as well, we ran this fintech case my junior year. No one else was running. And we had to over explain it in case, like what fintech is, why it's relevant to the resolution, blah, blah, blah. Doing things like that where you're taking the extra steps to ensure that your argument isn't getting gut checked or you're not confusing people. Really good workaround for scenarios in which you might want to run a more unique argument in front of lay judges.
And so,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to kind of make sure I'm hearing you. So for you, it does somewhat depend on the context of the tournament, where you would run maybe a little bit more unique things in a, well, it depends on the context, but in the case of like things that might need a lot of explanation, you might actually do that at a TOC type tournament, whereas you'd be more hesitant to do that at a NSDA type tournament.
Yeah, exactly. Totally depends on the tournament. Totally depends on the judges, for sure.
I wanted to shift gears just a bit because obviously your competing days are done. And the last time we talked to you, they had just barely been over, right? And there was very little distance between you and your competitive days. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the case writing and things in general, how, if at all, have your opinions or your perspectives on debate, and again, if you want to make it specific to case writing or just whatever, how has that kind of changed, or if it, to what degree has it changed now that you've had the view from the back of the room? Because I'll definitely say, it's well known amongst coaches, especially as you get a little bit older. Not that means Sasan are especially old. Sasan's like 30 now, basically dying.
30 is horrible.
But anywho, like, it's very well understood that part of the reason that you lose your eligibility once you judge at your level is because it makes you a lot better at debate for a lot of people quite quickly, because they start to see what does matter and kind of peer behind the curtain. So how have things changed for you since you've moved into that space?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there hasn't been a huge amount of change. There have been some strategies that I've like fully thought through and thought up that I'm now wishing that I would have implemented more when I was debating. But in terms of case construction, I haven't really changed my philosophy that much. I have understood a few areas that are of particular importance that I underrated when I was debating. One of those is the necessity of being able to go for any one of your positions in your case and have a unique strategy that is totally different and completely actionable depending on if your first contention gets covered more or your third contention gets covered
internal
more.
collapsibility is the term we tend to use,
Yeah,
but yeah,
okay.
100% super.
Yeah, no, it's so important. And if you can have each one of your contentions do a different thing for you, you're just in such a good spot. One thing that we would even do a lot of the time that was honestly just driven by laziness more than like anything else, and that I think the vast majority of PFers that I know also do, they'll have one contention and they'll go for it 80% of the time on the AF, and then they'll have a contention on the neg that they go for 80% of the time, and then they'll have like two other links and impact that they just rarely go for. And that's not the way to do it at all. It's just not. You leave so much on the table because if you want to use your case as well as it can be used, it's all round specific. The case doesn't matter unless you make it matter, especially in the back half. So that's one of the biggest takeaways that that have emerged in my mind since I started coaching.
When I came to Pacific and got more familiar with stuff, one of the things I did as I was improving was I went back to DVC, and I sat down with two of our students at that time. I think might have been Meredith, I can't remember, but anyway, I sat down with them and I was explaining how we formatted cases, right? Because at Pacific, every single affirmative case is structured the exact same way, right? Where the top of case, it's like almost like a script, right? And it's kind of like, Mad Libs. And for us, the rule of thumb was always, anytime you turned in a file, like the first advantage has to be something that is intrinsic to the resolution, right? And so the point of that is a counter plan that exists outside of the resolution won't resolve for it. And the second advantage always had to be your answer to what you thought the most predictable disad was. And there were a bunch of little things throughout it, right? Where in the solvency level, you needed to always have an argument for why now is key, why your actor is key, to beat back counterplan type things. Once again, not a huge thing in PF, but I'm wondering if when you approach case construction, whether it's on the AF or the negative, you have any specific tricks or formulas. Like, reality is most of the kids who watch this kind of stuff, they're really hoping that there's some nugget in there that we're going to tell them some cheat code, shortcut,
and
whatever.
that only they will have watched this video.
Yes, and that it'll be actionable for them, right? And so in your approach to case writing, do you have anything like that? Do you think there's any small thing or organizational thing or whatever it is that should be in every AF or NAG case, regardless of the topic, that's just too utilitous to not do?
I think the biggest thing is to have separate tech and lay cases, because what you want out of a good tech and lay case is just like total opposites. You want as much diversification as you can have in a tech case. And a lot of the time you want, at least presentationally, as little diversification as you can have in a lay case. Within that undiversified structure, a lot of the time it can be super useful to have several links and multiple impacts within sort of one narrative style contention. And that's actually one criticism I would have of the case we just reviewed from Sasan, which is that I think you could have benefited from having more unique links as to why social media propagates misinformation and such, because that just really eases your frontlining burden. Because instead of having to frontline 4 minutes, or let's say they spend 2 on the link, you have to frontline 1 because if you have multiple links or whatever. So, but yeah, separate tech and lay cases are huge. And it seems obvious, but the vast majority of teams I work with, before I work with them, just are, rolling with one case.
That they wrote like a couple days before the tournament.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one case can sometimes work if it's constructed in such a way where it can sort of like appeal to everyone, but I don't think it's ever really optimal when you just have.
Well, because nobody votes halfway between how a traditional judge and how a techie judge votes, right? So if your case is halfway between those two things, it's not like there's no one that it perfectly appeals to at that point. Paul, you were going to say something. I have 2 questions, but go ahead.
I was just gonna say that for me specifically, when it was around Nats time for us, right, and around that time, State and Nats, my big coaching priority shifts completely away from parliamentary debate and shifts towards Lincoln Douglas debate, because that's where I can have the most impact and make the biggest difference with the kids and whatnot, with helping them with files and stuff. And a huge thing that I do, and I've always done since my days at Pacific, is I will just send those kids a million versions of the same file, and I'll be like, I need you to send me a recording of you reading this, and I'll just sit there listening to it, and I'm like, nope, that's too fast. We're gonna have to change the case and make it more like nope, that's not understandable. We're gonna have, and like, just having so many revisions too. We always have something that says like shortest version of our thing or whatever, and usually in LD that's what it comes down to. It's not so much about a complexity issue, it's more of about like there's just too much for some judges and they don't want to hear it. And so yeah, I totally agree that like you just have to, and it's really not a ton more work, because your thesis for both cases can be identical. It's just the way that you approach structuring those cases and collapsing in those cases it's fundamentally different. But go ahead, Sasan,
well, just to respond to that real quickly, the ton of work comes from whether it's a case that you made and you understand. Because, yeah, we can cut a case that we understand the thesis of down shorter, because we'll understand what's essential and what isn't. But I feel like if I gave my case to some random person watching this video, they might have a harder time making a different version of it or a shorter version of it, which is I guess kind of why I included up top like what is the strategy behind this case. I'll get to that in just a second, but I did have another question, which is one of the things that with Paul and my background in parliamentary debate we have really firmly established is templates for arguments. And We need that because we have to construct arguments very, very quickly, right? Because we have like 15, 20 minutes to try to get entire cases written. In public forum, obviously, you don't have that time limit, and you write fewer cases per year. You know, we would write 8 cases.
10 a tournament.
Yeah, 10 a tournament. Because every round is a different thing, and hopefully you're doing your 6 prelims and getting, you know, into out rounds. But I guess my question is, when you don't have the time constraints and you have much fewer cases that you need to write, it seems to me that like a rigid template it plays less of a role. So how do you approach that when you're writing a case? Is it like the argument needs this A point, like an A point that's like establishing this sort of uniqueness scenario, and then I want to establish this sort of link, and you sort of like plug the topic into it? Or is it that you're reading the topic and you're like, okay, what are the necessary steps that I need to mention to get to the point I want to make?
Yeah, I would never use a template or anything like that. Beyond just general stuff about, like, you know, basic argument construction, like link warrant impact, whatever. I would totally never use a template, because you're right, you have a lot of time to research the particulars of a case. And also you'll have arguments where it just makes sense to start with something that might be different than the way that you start with another argument. So traditionally you always start with uniqueness, but some arguments, like, you know, like the uniqueness might not be as important. It might be more like a scalar argument, might be more intuitive on the uniqueness level. And so in that case, it might not make sense to start with the uniqueness. So yeah, I definitely didn't use any templates like that in PF.
Can I ask a question? This is a very, very tiny question, right? So because of what Sasan's saying, where we had to write 1 million cases, you have to formulatize it, and then especially because at the state and national championships for community colleges, your students do not get to access their coaches. They have to entirely in 15 minutes or whatever prep by themselves, not even with their teammates, etc. So we have to do a lot of formula stuff. So we've developed as a community, not necessarily us, specific concepts and even like subtypes of specific things. So when I'm going to just say a word, and I want to know if this is even a word that like you've thought of in that way, or it's just a thing you intuitively did or just know nothing about, right? Which is predictive uniqueness. Like, is that a thing that comes up in PF, the difference between uniqueness and predictive uniqueness?
No.
Okay, so in the context of Parley, whenever we're writing a file, we will always have 3 subpoints, right, for uniqueness. The first one is always shit's good or bad, relevant to the topic, right? So if it's an econ dissad, currently the economy is good based on crypto, whatever the fuck, right? But then the second thing you'll have is predictive uniqueness, which says, and that is likely to continue to be the trend for whatever reason, right? Predictions 6 months from now say that, blah, 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 blah. And then your third thing is more of a bright line argument that says, however, specific thing could change that up. AF plan will do that, etc. And the reason we do that is because if they read a thumper that's like, actually, here's 17 reasons why the economy is bad right now, if they concede that second argument, which says, but in 6 months it will be good, we still have like game on that, right? And so stuff like that, like little kind of intricacies, become like everyone at the highest level is using predictive uniqueness to a certain degree there. And I just never even considered that. I guess in non-plan focused and in debate where you have months to prepare, the research will just say it one way or the other, and you're not like trying desperately to stay up to date every Friday and downloading all these different statistics and having them in a back file in case you need to pull them out in PF. That's interesting to me. Because it's like, I'm like, oh yeah, this is something like I tell like my students have to know that concept or whatever, but I guess it doesn't translate, or it's not even necessary because you just have evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I totally have used that whole concept of like establishing the trend for the future like 1,000 times. That's
totally
part and parcel of any uniqueness argument that we try to make. And like, they are different concepts though, like the present condition versus the anticipated condition in the future. And that's really interesting, but that's just not a concept that, at least the delineation between uniqueness and predictive uniqueness really doesn't exist in PF.
Sure.
Well,
okay, sorry,
no. That transitions pretty well because, okay, part of the And I haven't written a lot of LD cases. Paul did LD. I've just coached it. Part of what's difficult for me, because like clearly here I'm not following the type of template that we would do in parliamentary debate, right? It's not like here's our 2 advantages and the first uniqueness is shit's good right now and it's gonna get better. But because of that, when I'm writing a case, in my head, I don't want to leave any logical gaps, right? Like if we look at the case, and I can pull it back up, it's I don't know like how many cards in an AF is a little or a lot, but it's like a 12 card AF, but a lot of them are like, I'm using the CRS. Oh, and by the way, here's why the CRS is a good source. Or I think this part explains it really well. Okay, so people use social media. And if you're on social media, you're exposed to misinformation. And even though there's moderation, that doesn't really work. And even though there's also accurate information, that doesn't really fix things. And I feel like when I'm doing that, so much of it is like, what could possibly be said against this? And how do I plug all of those holes, so to speak, right? How do I defend against all of the things that could be criticized about my case? But one of the things that does is I couldn't make this a 2 contention case if I wanted to. Because unless these kids are reading really fast, honestly faster than I can read, like this is going to take a lot of time. And logically, I know that like, okay, some of this information can get left for later, right? Like, okay, let's not have even if there's accurate information, it doesn't do any good in the actual case. Maybe they will make that argument, and if they do, we'll have this in our back pocket and we'll read that argument then. But I don't really have any sense of how to pull that off in case writing, because as far as like coaching or whatever, or just doing these for demonstrative values goes, I've only written this part of the case. I haven't written a full case and blocks and answers and thumpers and whatever, front lines. And so it's hard for me to know like which stuff doesn't necessarily need to go into the case itself. And I feel like that's a really important thing to know if I'm trying to condense my case, especially if I'm trying to like read cards, right? I need to know like, okay, well, which of these things needs to be said, which of them doesn't need to be said. And I guess you can either speak specifically to this case or broadly how you approach this, whatever make it easier for you to speak on the question. How do you approach knowing, okay, this information could be useful for me to convey, but how do I determine how necessary it is? And then how do I best determine where in the debate it belongs?
Yeah. So one thing that doesn't necessarily need to be in the case is preemption. Preemption can be in the case and can be super helpful for the case. But for example, the section that's like the report also makes it crystal clear, that doesn't necessarily need to be in like a bare bones version of the case. Because what it does is it answers the concern that's like, oh, this will happen in like other ways, right? But in PF, you don't necessarily need to prove straight out of your case that this is a exclusive harm per se. You just need to have, a link and an impact with a warrant for why that's all the case. And then someone can say, oh, it's not unique. And then you can answer the non-unique response. But you could use that. You could use this section to provide that answer. So, but the other side of that is that this is a narrative style case, and it's meant for the layest of lay audiences. And in such a case, it totally does make sense to have some preemptive material that strengthens any one of the intuitive weaknesses that may or may not be in the argument. So like you mentioned earlier, it is kind of an obvious weakness that, hey, people spread misinformation with or without social media. So in this case, it it certainly makes sense to have something like this in the case, but it doesn't need to be in the case, if that makes
Can I
sense.
ask then? So on that, I think this is directly tied into that concept, right? In Parley, I tell my kids this all the time, and I think this is also true to a certain degree in LD. The first speech in Parley is basically a waste of everyone's time, right? Like it is objectively, to a certain degree, the least important speech in the debate is the affirmative's first speech, because the affirmative always goes first in Parley, right? And because there's just nothing for them to do other than read a case, right? They get to read pure offense and stuff.
I
and
think.
so
Sorry, I think another way of framing like that's not important. It's not like it doesn't have a consequence in the round, but you're no closer to determining who's winning or losing by having just seen the first speech, right? Whereas by the first negative speech, you can very quickly start being like, okay, here's who's ahead and here's who's behind.
Well, and what I really mean to say is this, right? The MG, which is the second affirmative speech in Parley, has a fuck ton to do, right? They have to build a giant wall that discourages the speeches after them from going for certain arguments, close doors while leaving doors open for their partner, and the other team gets a block where they're going to talk for 12 minutes straight, and my partner's only going to have 4 minutes to answer, or 5 minutes to answer, right? And so the PMC, the meta, has become, what people do in Parley is they might read 4 minutes of case and 3 minutes of preempts, kind of like they do in very technical LD debate at like the high school level, right? Where they read the app, they get the advantage out, and then the bottom is just the negative is not allowed to contest this, the affirmative gets framework choice, conditionality cannot be read, and blah blah, like whatever it might be, right? And that is because the time in the MG is so much more constrained and valuable. And so, per PF, do you think it is the first speech or the second speech that their time is more valuable? Because I think that kind of answers the question of whether you need preempts or not. If the first speech is basically just you're just getting stuff out there because you have to, preempts probably should be there, especially if the second speech is hard. But if the second speech is actually pretty easy to handle for the affirmative, assuming they go first, then it kind of makes way more sense to leave the work for them in that speech and let the AF just develop pure offense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first rebuttal is not a very hard speech.
Okay, that totally explains it. That's what was my intuition.
Yeah, especially when compared to the second rebuttal, which
second rebuttal sucks, right?
Second rebuttal is really tough. Second rebuttal, you have to respond to the entire rebuttal. You have to respond to 8 minutes and 4 minutes, and in the first rebuttal, you have to respond to 4 minutes and 4 minutes. So if it makes sense to like preempt or do something crazy, I think it would probably make sense to do it in the second constructive as opposed to the first constructive.
Okay, I know you have a hard out here in just a few minutes, and so I wanted to definitely give you an opportunity to talk about any of the stuff you're doing right now, and the coaching you're doing, the places you're working for, where people can see your stuff, and it seems like you've been more and more active with that, and so floor is yours, dude. Like,
thanks, man. I appreciate it. So I'm working with this organization called Debate Drills. They're great, been super successful in LD, and they're doing PF now. And so I will send these guys a link to hopefully put in the description. And what we offer is a few things. First, we're trying to put together the biggest and best prep group / club team next year that exists anywhere in PF. Secondly, in the summer, I'm hosting summer classes, and they're being taught by me, my old partner, and then also Sasha Haynes, who won NSDA Nationals. So if you want to work with us in those summer classes, that's also available on this page. And then we also do one-on-one tutoring as well. And then finally, we offer a bunch of free resources too, and you can see all of this stuff on the site, which should be in the description. But thanks so much for letting me say that, and thanks as always for having me on here. It's always great to talk with you guys and hear your perspectives.
Of course.
And we appreciate it, man. It's always been really fun.
One more question to you you, and I think this will speak somewhat to the kind of work that people can look forward to working with you over the summer, because I'm imagining that you're probably doing a lot of work getting ready for the September topics, right? Which is my understanding of looking at those topics right now is that, or not even just hearing people talk about it on the subreddit, is that people feel that they're very like almost plan driven topics. So Paul, in case you're not familiar, just
I totally am. I was going to ask this earlier, but we kind of ran low on time. So yeah, totally
right. So I just want to kind of like touch on. So let's take one of them. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization should substantially increase its defense commitments to the Baltic states. That is exactly the kind of resolution we would have in parliamentary debate. And in a world where you're not allowed to run a plan, and you're not allowed, and like the negative might have to speak first, so you don't even know what like specific affirmative advocacy you're responding to in a way. I guess my question is, what do you foresee being like the skill sets and the things that people will have to like learn this summer to be prepared for that topic?
Right. I mean, it's another topic where it's all going to come down to your advocacy, which is the PF's. It's just like the WIMP version of a plan, basically. It's plan light, where it's like you might have a few words at the top that specify generally what you mean, but by and large, your quote unquote advocacy will just be borne out in the contentions you're talking about, where it's like, oh, troop commitments here are really important for this reason. And then that sort of becomes the version of substantially increase that you advocate for. So I just don't understand why they ban plans and counter plans and then do this.
I think the neg is bodied on these resolutions.
But
dude.
I guess
if you don't get negative fiat or T, like
I think you're right that it's your advocacy is what your contentions are. But I guess the question is, how do you approach not linking into your opponent's arguments, right? Because like if they're saying, oh, like a substantial increase would mean this and here's why that's bad, how do you approach being like, but that's not a thing that I think we should do?
Yeah, that is all. It just kind of gets decided like round by round, free form. Some teams will go really hard on being like, no, we do not advocate for that. That is not our advocacy. So you are not topical, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the time, everyone will just sort of agree that we have like these independent scenarios, right? And so the AF will get to say the versions of substantially increasing that they like, and the neg will get to say the versions of it that they don't like. And then we'll just continue with these three contentions that stem from sort of ambiguous understanding of what the actual execution of the topic truly is.
I might have to judge some PF next year.
Area.
I just want to see what it's going to be like. I really do. Because it just sounds, I totally am in line with both of you. Like it's very confusing for either team because it's like, that's hashtag not our AF. And apparently it is. But yeah, you got to go in a minute. I'm sure you want a little bit of time between your meeting.
No, hey, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, catch you later.
All right, have a good one, Jack. Thank you so much.
You too. Peace.